I'm Scott Allen Miller, and on today's special vlog, I'm going to be answering Matias's question about Tennessee whiskey and bourbon, because we mentioned in another episode that Jack Daniel's is not a bourbon, which is not 100% accurate. I mean, it is accurate that I said that. It is not absolutely 100% accurate that it's not a bourbon, mostly because what is a bourbon is not a clear definition. So let's dig into it. Now, Matias said, well, I thought all whiskeys made in the United States are bourbons. That's not entirely true either. All of these definitions are a little bit soft because of the way that the U.S. handles it, and really, it probably should be soft definitions. Some of the definitions of things like cognac, saying that they have to be made in a special region of France, means you're not talking about what the alcohol is, but where it's made, but we treat it as if it's what it is. And so we actually do something really bad with how we call alcohols around the world. It's a terrible process, and it has nothing to do with, what you're actually getting or ordering. And so you could make something completely different in a region, or similar but different, and be able to label it as something that it isn't because of where it came from, and make something that's identical somewhere else in the world, but not be able to call it what it is because you don't have a name for it, because everything's named off of regions. It also creates a lot of problems because once a government steps in, like they have in Cognac or Bordeaux or Tennessee, they create very stringent definitions as to what their products are under that name, and as we'll see in a minute with Tennessee whiskey, and that will stifle competition or create really awkward situations where newcomers don't necessarily have the right to create their own products, and so it becomes a bit of government overstep, where simple things like creating a new drink, that is how all of those companies got started, and most of them pretty recently did what they do, and you're no longer allowed to do that because one or two distillers came up with a process, and now everyone must follow it to be legal. So it's really weird. So what is a bourbon? A bourbon must be made in the United States according to the United States to ship it from the U.S. or sell it in the U.S. But if it's made anywhere else in the world, it can be called a bourbon because no one has that strict definition of bourbon, possibly because bourbon is a region in France, not a region in the United States. There is no region of bourbon in the U.S. There is Bourbon County in Kentucky, after which the whiskey is named, but it's not a region. So that makes it a little bit awkward. Maybe that's why. But you can make bourbons anywhere. You just can't then sell them in the U.S. But in the United States, if you want to have a bourbon under U.S. legislation, then you can make it anywhere in the United States. But it must meet very specific standards as to what it's made with, how it's made, how it is aged, and how strong it is. Now, they're pretty broad, so you can do an awful lot of different things in the U.S., hence the incredible variety of bourbons. And personally, bourbon is one of my favorite styles of whiskey. However, Canadian whiskeys, or things commonly associated with Canadian whiskeys like a rye, is generally not a bourbon, but you can make that in the United States. So there are American whiskeys that are not bourbons. They do exist. Another category of whiskey is the Tennessee whiskey. Now, originally, Tennessee was simply a region making whiskeys, but after Prohibition, most of the distilleries went away, Jack Daniel's being the first to reopen, and now a few others have as well. In Tennessee, it is traditional, but only traditional, to use the Lincoln County process to make their whiskey. So it's categorized by the U.S. government generally as being a bourbon that has this additional process of maple charcoal filtering. Now, some of the things that make this problematic: it must be filtered, it must be maple, it must be charcoal. There's all these things, and if you don't do that, you're not considered a Tennessee whiskey, even if you make your whiskey in Tennessee. Unless you're an old Tennessee distillery, then they give you a pass and you get to make whatever you want and still have the name Tennessee whiskey. You can see where the problems go with this. If you want to make something new and it doesn't conform with Jack Daniel's standards, then you end up with some thing that can't be called Tennessee whiskey, even though it's really a whiskey and really made in Tennessee. The problems become big, and it really is a system. People will claim it's for. I'm very passionate about this. People will say, governments will say, this is about a quality standard, and it is anything but quality. The one thing that they're not ever checking is quality. The only things they care about are conformity, and conformity to a government instituted standard that means nothing. So if you make a Tennessee whiskey, you would never sell it somewhere else because no one else wants to do that process, because no one in Kentucky, for example, considers that a good way to make whiskey. So what Tennessee is claiming to be quality, the rest of the world says, what? And it's not that the process is necessarily good or bad. but it is not about quality. So, but one of the key things is nearly all of the Tennessee whiskey makers, such as Jack Daniel's, are pretty adamant about not being a bourbon. They say they are a Tennessee whiskey, not a bourbon, as opposed to a Tennessee whiskey style of bourbon. Now, which is correct? That's disputable. Everyone kind of has their own definition of bourbon. Under U.S. federal trade legislation, Tennessee whiskeys are almost always a bourbon. Certainly Jack Daniel's is under that standard, but under the normal usage of the term bourbon, they're not a bourbon. If you went into a bar and ordered a bourbon and they served you a Jack Daniel's, that would be an error. They should not do that. If you ask for a bourbon and Coke, that should not be Jack Daniel's. That is a Jack and Coke or a Tennessee whiskey and Coke. And there are other Tennessee whiskey makers, but certainly Jack Daniel's is the 800-pound gorilla of the Tennessee market, just as Jim Beam is the 800-pound gorilla of the bourbon market. So they are distinct as bartending would go. As far as trade status, well, they're a thing. Now, Tennessee whiskeys are federally legislated as well. There's a federal U.S. rule that says what is a Tennessee whiskey, and that one is required to be honored under NAFTA. So all of the countries, like here in Nicaragua, have to use the same labeling standards for bourbon and Tennessee whiskey because they're part of that agreement. But if you're in the state of Tennessee and you want to be labeled as a Tennessee whiskey that actually comes from Tennessee, there are more stringent requirements, but they include things that people think are somewhat questionable. So that is kind of the high-level view. So while technically you can make an argument that Jack Daniel's is a bourbon, under some definitions, it is not considered a bourbon and doesn't taste like a bourbon under bartending and normal discussion characteristics. But bourbons can be made anywhere in the United States, but only certain types of things are bourbons. Tennessee whiskey can only be made in Tennessee, but not every whiskey made in Tennessee is a Tennessee whiskey, even if it's a whiskey made Tennessee, or a Tennessee made whiskey. Whew. Hope that clears some of that up. Yes, mezcal is delicious, and Flor de Caña, of course, that's your favorite rum because it's the best. And if you are looking for well rums, you can get Flor de Caña that's pretty cheap. But if you're like me and a huge fan of Flor de Caña, when I'm doing well rums, I actually use Crugen, which is American made, if I'm in the U.S., because the prices are much better for a well rum. It's the best well rum. Flor de Caña is a call and top shelf depending on the year. Thanks for joining me. If you'd like to subscribe, do so. This is your chance. Go down and hit that button. We talk about all kinds of things here, not necessarily travel or living abroad or Nicaragua or digital nomadry or whatever. And definitely hit that like button. It helps a lot. If you'd like to support the channel, of course, you can buy me a coffee. Think of it as buying me a rum and Coke or a bourbon. I would love it. Can't get bourbons here very easily. That is a huge bummer, which is what brought up this topic. I really want to start bringing in some bourbons here because bourbons and ryes are my favorite, followed by Scotch is my favorite whiskeys to drink. And yeah, share on social media. I will see all of you tomorrow.